Magruder's American Government, Chapter 21, Civil Rights, Equal Justice Under Law, Section 1, Diversity and Discrimination. Have you read George Orwell's classic Animal Farm? Even if you have not, you may have heard its most oft-quoted line, "All animals are created equal, but some animals are more equal than others." You might keep Orwell's comment in mind as you read this chapter. A heterogeneous society. The term heterogeneous is a compound of two Greek words, hetero, meaning other or different, and genos, meaning race, family, or kind. Something that is heterogeneous is composed of dissimilar parts made up of elements that are unrelated to or unlike one another. In short, something composed of a mix of ingredients. We, the people of the United States, are a heterogeneous lot, and we are becoming more so year to year. The population of the United States is predominantly white. It is today, and as you can see in the circle graph on page 614, it has been historically. The first census in 1790 reported that there were 3,929,214 people living in this country. More than 4 out of 5 were white. African Americans made up the remaining 19% of the population counted in that census. As the nation's population grew over the decades, so too did the proportion of the American people who were white until recently. Today, the ethnic composition of the population is strikingly different from what was only a generation ago. Immigrants, those aliens legally admitted as permanent residents, have arrived in near-record numbers every year since the mid-1960s. Over that period, the nation's African American, Hispanic American, and Asian American populations have grown at rates several times that of the white population. Indeed, the minority population now exceeds the white population in 4 states: California, Hawaii, New Mexico, and Texas. A look at gender balance in the population reveals that females are more numerous than males. This has been the case for more than half a century. As a result of these changes in the American population, the United States is more heterogeneous today than ever. That fact is certain to have a profound effect on the American social, political, and economic landscape through the 21st century. Race-based discrimination. White Americans have been historically reluctant to yield to non-white Americans a full and equal place in the social, economic, and political life of this nation. Over time, the principal targets of that ethnic prejudice have been African Americans, Native Americans, Asian Americans, and Hispanic Americans. The white male-dominated power structure has also been slow to recognize the claims of women to an equal place in American society. African Americans. Much of what you will read in these pages focuses on discrimination against African Americans. There are 3 principal reasons for this focus. First, African Americans have been the victims of consistent and deliberate unjust treatment for a longer time than any other minority group of Americans. The ancestors of most African Americans came to this country in chains. Over a period of some 200 years, tens of thousands of Africans were kidnapped, crammed aboard sailing ships, brought to America, and then sold in slave markets. As slaves, they were legal property of other human beings. They could be bought and sold and forced to do their owner's bidding, however harsh the circumstances. It took a civil war to end more than 2 centuries of slavery in this country. The 13th Amendment finally abolished slavery in 1865. Still, the Civil War and the ratification of that amendment did not end widespread racial discrimination in the United States. Second, African Americans constitute a huge minority group in the United States. They number nearly 40 million today, some 14% of all the American people. Finally, most of the gains the nation has made in translating the Constitution's guarantees of equality into reality for all persons have come out of the efforts made by and on behalf of African Americans. Recall that, for example, the struggles of Martin Luther King Jr. and others resulted in the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and then the Voting Rights Act of 1965. See Chapter 6, Section 3. America is now an inescapably multiracial society. Still, unlike whites, African Americans live with the consequences of America's history of racial discrimination every day of their lives. Of course, this is not to say that other groups of Americans have not also suffered the effects of discrimination. Clearly, many have. Native Americans. The white settlers first began to arrive in America in relatively large numbers in the mid-1600s. At the time, some 1 million Native Americans were living in territory that was to become the United States. By 1900, however, their number had fallen to less than 250,000. Diseases brought by white settlers decimated those first Americans. So, too, did the succession of military campaigns that accompanied the westward expansion of the United States. To quote one leading commentator, "The only good Indian is a dead Indian," is not simply a hackneyed expression from cowboy movies. It was part of the strategy of westward expansion, as settlers and the U.S. troops mercilessly drove the eastern Indians from their ancestral lands to the Great Plains, and then took those lands too. Thomas E. Patterson, The American Democracy. Today, about 6 million Native Americans live in this country. Nearly a quarter of them live on or near reservations, which are public lands set aside by government for use by Native American tribes. Like African Americans, Native Americans have been the victims of overwhelming discrimination. The consequences of that bias have been appalling, and they remain evident today. Poverty, joblessness, and alcoholism plague many reservations. The Indian Education Act of 1972 attempted to remedy the cycle of continual poverty by providing financial assistance to local educational agencies for Native American children and adult programs. Still, the life expectancy of Native Americans living on reservations today is 10 years less than the national average, and the Native American infant mortality rate is 1.5 times that of white Americans. Hispanic Americans. Hispanic Americans are those in this country who have a Spanish-speaking background. Many prefer to be called Latinos. Hispanics may be of any race. According to the Bilateral Commission on the Future of the United States-Mexican Relations, Hispanic Americans are among the world's most complex groupings of human beings. The largest number are white, millions are mestizo, nearly 500,000 in the United States are black or mulatto. Today, the number of Hispanic Americans exceeds 50 million, and they constitute the largest minority group in this country, having surpassed African Americans sometime around the year 2000. They are also the nation's fastest growing population group. Hispanic Americans can generally be divided into 4 main subgroups. 1. Mexican Americans. Well over half of all Hispanics in the United States, some 32 million persons, were either born in Mexico or trace their ancestry there. Those born in this country of Mexican parents are often called Chicanos. Most of the Mexican American population lives in the states of California, Texas, Arizona, and Illinois, but that population is spreading throughout much of the country. A majority of the residents of such large cities as El Paso and San Antonio in Texas are Hispanic today, and such smaller border cities as Laredo and Brownsville in Texas are now over 90% Latino. 2. Puerto Ricans. Another large group of Hispanics has come to the mainland from the island of Puerto Rico. The Puerto Rican population of the United States now approaches 5 million. Most of them have settled in New York, Florida, and New Jersey. 3. Cuban Americans. The Hispanic population also includes some 1.8 million Cuban Americans. They are mostly people who fled the Castro dictatorship in Cuba and their descendants. A majority of them have settled in Miami and elsewhere in South Florida, as well as in California and New Jersey. 4. Central and South Americans. The fourth major subgroup of Hispanic Americans came here from Central and South America, many as refugees. A refugee is one who seeks protection, refuge, from war, persecution, or some other danger. Nearly 7 million persons have emigrated to the United States from Central and South American countries over the past 30 years or so. They have arrived in the largest numbers from El Salvador, Guatemala, Colombia, and Honduras. Many have also come from the Dominican Republic, an island nation in the Caribbean. Asian Americans. The story of white Americans' mistreatment of Asians is a lengthy one, too. Asians have faced discrimination from the first day they arrived. As with all immigrant groups, assimilation into the white-dominated population has been difficult. Assimilation is the process by which people of one culture merge into and become part of another. Chinese laborers were the first Asians to come to the United States in large numbers. They were brought here in the 1850s to 1860s as contract laborers to work in the mines and to build railroads in the West. Many white Americans, both native-born and immigrants, resented the competition of what they called coolie labor. Their resentments were frequently expressed in acts of violence towards Asians. Congress brought Chinese immigration to a near halt with the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. Because of this and other governmental actions, only a very small number of Chinese, Japanese, and other Asians were permitted to enter the United States for more than 80 years. Early in World War II, the federal government ordered the evacuation of all persons of Japanese descent from the Pacific coast. Some 120,000 people, 2/3 of them native-born American citizens, were forcibly removed to inland war relocation camps. Years later, the government conceded that this action had been both unnecessary and unjust. Congress made dramatic changes in American immigration policies in 1965. Since then, some 11 million Asian immigrants have come to this country, mostly from the Philippines, China, Korea, Vietnam, and India. The term Asian Americans encompasses an ever more diverse population. Asian Americans represent a tremendous variety of languages, religions, and cultures, and many recent immigrants from Asia have little in common with one another. Today, Asian Americans number some 18 million. Asian Americans now live in every part of the United States. They constitute some 40% of the population in Hawaii and more than 10% of the population in California. New York City boasts the largest Chinese community outside Asia. Discrimination against women. Unlike the several ethnic groups described thus far, women are not a minority in the United States. They are, in fact, a majority group. Still, traditionally in American law and public policy, women have not enjoyed the same rights as men. Their status was even lower in many instances than men who were themselves a target of virulent discrimination. Women have been treated as less than equal in a great many matters, including, for example, property rights, education, and employment opportunities. Organized efforts to impose the place of women in American society date from July 19, 1848. On that day, a convention on women's rights met in Seneca Falls, New York, and adopted a set of resolutions that deliberately echoed the words of the Declaration of Independence. It began, "When, in the course of human events, it becomes necessary for one portion of the family of man to assume among the people of the earth a position different from that which they have hitherto occupied, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men and women are created equal." Declaration of Sentiments, 1848. Those who fought and won the long struggle for women's suffrage believed that, with the vote, women would soon achieve other basic rights. That assumption proved false. Although almost 51% of the population is now female, women hold only a minor fraction of the nation's top public offices. Even today, women hold less than 20% of the seats in Congress and less than 25% of the seats in the 50 state legislatures. Only 5 of the 50 state governors today are female. While women have made some strides in the fields of medicine and law, they still comprise less than 40% of the nation's doctors and lawyers. They are hugely underrepresented in the upper levels of corporate management, and even more so in the engineering field, where they make up less than 10% of the workforce. It is illegal to pay women less than men for the same work. The Equal Pay Act of 1963 requires employers to pay men and women the same wages if they perform the same jobs in the same establishment under the same working conditions. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 also prohibits job discrimination based on sex. Yet, more than 45 years after Congress passed those laws, working women earn, on average, less than 80 cents for every dollar earned by a working man. See the cartoon and graph on page 616. Women earn less than men for a number of reasons, including the fact that male workforce is, overall, better educated and has more job experience than the female workforce. Note that these factors themselves can often be traced to discrimination. In addition, some blame the so-called mommy track, in which women put their careers on hold to have children or work reduced hours to juggle childcare responsibilities. Others claim that a glass ceiling of discrimination in the corporate world and elsewhere, invisible but impenetrable, prevents women from rising to their full potential. Certainly it is true that until quite recently, women were limited to a fairly narrow range of jobs. In many cases, women were encouraged not to work outside the home once they were married. Even now, many jobs held by women are in low-paying clerical and service occupations. The Bureau of Labor Statistics reports that 96% of all secretaries today are women. So too are 95% of all child care workers, 91% of all registered nurses, 90% of all bookkeepers and auditing clerks, and 91% of all dietitians and nutritionists. Efforts on behalf of equal rights for women have gained significant ground in recent years, but recall that significant ground has not included an equal rights amendment to the Constitution.